I heard you talk about how certain groups, especially among immigrants, are less likely to get a diagnosis. And I have been hearing about how a particular group of immigrants, that immigrants from Somalia, are apparently more likely to get a diagnosis. I was just wondering if you had heard of this and whether you had any idea whether there was a reason for this or whether it's just one of those who knows.
You know, I'm probably one of the few people in the room who's been to Somalia, but I'm not aware if there is a sort of scientifically proven true increase in rate. I think the issues for immigrant population, on the one hand, to do with language barriers or lack of access to services, and on the other, to do with variations in cultural attitudes to stigmatization. So I do a fair bit of work in India, and there are huge social pressures not to have a child identified with any neurodevelopmental disorder because of issues it will cause for the family more broadly. So I think generally the issues are to do with language, impaired access to services, and variations between cultures in how stigmatization is viewed.
I was curious. Yesterday, it was noted that a lot of the times mothers will be diagnosed after they've had their own child. I was curious what else brings either young adults or adults reaching into their 30s and 40s. What's the most common thing that brings them to you searching for a diagnosis?
So just as they come to mind, rather in order of priority, I think sometimes it takes people a while to come around to the idea that they might have something that affects them that's got a name to it. The second issue is that sometimes people have to be stuck for a long time before they or their parents think something needs to change. So many of the adults that I see are still at home, unemployed, and that leads to another issue, which is parents start to get increasingly concerned about what's going to happen to their adult child when they're no longer around to look after them and provide for them. And then another group of people seek help because they develop anxiety or depression or OCD. They come in contact with a doctor who realizes actually, yes, there's that, but it's on the background of their lives not really having worked out as well as they might. And then there are lots of people who, for various reasons, have never previously been aware of ASD. It's not something that's been in the family. They've never come in contact with anyone, and then someone watches a TV show or they sit next to someone on a bus in Costa Rica. I did have that happen, and start talking about their son to someone who turned out to be a psychologist, sat next to them, who said, "Oh, I think your son's probably got ASD. You should go and get a diagnosis." So for many families, it's sort of some chance occurrence. My experience has been, and this is a generalization, this is not true at an individual level, that women are usually more willing to have an assessment and more accepting of a diagnosis than the men that I see. Often the men have been dragged there semi-willingly by their parents. And actually that's not a good situation, because one of the advantages of getting a diagnosis is that it enables you over time to come to terms with yourself and realize which things you're can do something about, and which are things that actually it wasn't your fault that things didn't pan out. And that adjustment process takes different periods of time in different people, but is usually an extremely beneficial process. So for me, the main advantage of diagnosing an adult is it enables that person to eventually see themselves in a different and usually less critical light.
I was just wondering, in your experience, and maybe you might have something to add afterwards, after women and other adults receive their diagnosis later on in life, do you see a decrease in the anxiety and the depression and the medication, or in some cases, individuals that might be self-medicating?
Part of the association, I think, between ASD and, for instance, anxiety must be because it must be anxiety-provoking to have ASD and move in a world where you're not recognizing all of the signals and all of the nuances. You're potentially at a disadvantage. So I think that in itself is a contributory factor. But if you look at relatives, the rate of anxiety is increased in relatives as well, which is suggesting that maybe some of the genes that predispose to ASD also have a role in some of these other conditions. In other words, it wouldn't matter what you did or how well you coped socially, you might still be an anxious person. So I don't think all the anxiety goes, but I do see a lot of very relieved people. Literally, it's like a weight is lifted from their shoulders. In part, I think, because people naturally assume that if things are not going well, it must be them that's to blame. You know, because you're like a walking locus of difficulty, and it seems to follow you around, so it must be you. So the anxiety may not drop, but I think this sense that actually is not all my fault tends to gradually disappear, and I think that's a huge relief for lots of people.
Another question we have, what assessment tools are you using for diagnosing high-functioning adult women?
So I'm old and stuck in my ways, so I still use the ADI and the ADOS, in part because I teach worldwide on those instruments, so it sort of keeps me up to date. And it's fine, I'm a university professor, I can take that time to do that. Does it make sense worldwide to do that for everybody? No. We have to have more efficient ways of collecting data rather than using instruments that were primarily designed for research.
We have another question here. Dr. Bailey, do you see any future change in the diagnostic criteria in the DSM for diagnosing ASD, particularly in women? I think William Mandy addressed this yesterday about do you see the discussions we're starting to have now about the low incidence of women being diagnosed with autism?
So for me, the issue is not to do with the criteria. The criteria, absolutely fine. It's how you interpret them and how sensitive you are as a clinician. And whether your mindset is to see the elephant in the room or to ignore it. So two clinicians might see exactly the same ADOS, and one might say, oh no, this is a girl with social anxiety, language delay, and OCD. Or an attachment disorder. And another clinician might say, no, the parsimonious explanation of this is an autism spectrum disorder. And by and large, I think diagnostic rates are influenced by the experience of the clinician and also whether there are either overt or covert pressures on them to diagnose or not diagnose, because there are financial implications of making a diagnosis.
So when we look at the data, we look at the data produced by the CDC in the United States and the new FAC data. Although the methodologies are different, the outcome, the rates are similar, particularly that difference between a 1-to-4 ratio between males and females. So if we consider that United States and Canada, we have similar clinicians doing these assessments and making these diagnoses, psychiatrists, developmental pediatricians, psychologists, etc. Do you think this is an artifact of their training, of the curriculum that is somewhat variable but similar between the United States and Canada in training these diagnosticians?
We're having a focus on girls and women, and of course, inevitably, we've had a focus on the fact that there is some underdiagnosis of women. Are we missing 200% of the women with ASD? No. So I think this is an educational issue for clinicians to learn which things we should weight more in women. And so if you remember, I was saying earlier that the BC government doesn't require that a child passes the algorithm criteria on the ADI and the ADOS for autism, because we know that the instruments are only part of the overall clinical picture. And that's a very sensible approach, because experienced clinicians weight different symptoms and signs differently according to the context in which they occur. So if I have if I have a PhD student who suddenly starts some autistic hand and finger mannerisms, I consider that much more important than in someone with no language, very low intellectual abilities and epilepsy. In one context, it's very useful diagnostically, in the other, it's not much help at all. Usually, it's not as conscious a process as that, so clinicians are carrying out these, and not just for ASD, for any disorder. When you go and see your family doctor or a specialist, an experienced person has seen hundreds of people with that condition before, and they know that there are certain things that if they see it, that probably means the person almost certainly got the disorder. And so we need to understand what are those nuances in presentation that we should be paying more attention to in girls. It's not that the criteria themselves are fundamentally wrong.